The desolate beginning. The icy winds howled across the barren wasteland of the forgotten planet. Jagged rocks and patches of frozen ground stretched endlessly in every direction, creating an unforgiving landscape where life was not meant to survive. Lyra lay motionless on the frozen ground, her breaths shallow and weak. Her once radiant silver skin, a mark of her royal heritage, was now pale and cracked from the harsh cold. The faint light of two suns above cast eerie shadows across her frail body, highlighting the despair etched into her delicate features. She had been left here to die, a decision made by her own people. Born with a mutation that the royal court deemed a curse, Lyra had been cast aside as a disgrace. Her extra pair of crystalline wings, instead of being a symbol of beauty, was seen as a reminder of imperfection in her otherwise proud race. The words of her father, the king, echoed in her fading consciousness. No daughter of mine will bring shame to the throne. Lyra had tried to fight against her fate. She begged, pleaded, and even challenged the council's decree, but no one had listened. They loaded her into a pod and sent her to this desolate planet, a graveyard for the unwanted. Days turned into nights, and Lyra's hope began to crumble under the weight of her isolation. Her body grew weaker with every passing moment, and even her tears had dried in the merciless cold. As she lay there, a faint rumble in the distance stirred her senses. At first, she thought it was another illusion brought on by her deteriorating state, but the sound grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath her. Through her half-closed eyes, she saw a flicker of movement in the sky. A human starship, battered and barely holding together, came hurtling down from the heavens, trailing smoke and sparks. It crashed into the rocky terrain with a deafening roar, throwing up clouds of dust and debris. Inside the ship, Dr. Ethan Carter struggled to unbuckle his harness. His heart raced as alarms blared around him, the red warning lights casting an ominous glow. The crash had been rough, but he was alive. A mix of relief and frustration washed over him as he surveyed the damage to his vessel. Ethan was a medic, traveling through the galaxy to aid those in need, but now he found himself stranded on this forsaken planet. Stepping out of the ship, Ethan squinted against the harsh glare of the twin suns. His boots crunched against the frozen ground as he adjusted the scanner strapped to his wrist. He needed to find shelter and resources, but something unusual caught his attention. The scanner beeped faintly, picking up a faint life signal nearby. It wasn't strong, but it was there. Life. Out here. Ethan muttered, his brow furrowing in confusion. He followed the signal, his curiosity and training as a medic driving him forward. The closer he got, the more he felt an unsettling mix of anticipation and dread. And then he saw her. Lyra's form was barely distinguishable from the icy rocks around her. Her shimmering wings were curled tightly against her back, and her fragile body looked as though it might shatter if touched. Ethan knelt beside her, his breath visible in the frigid air. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if she was even alive. But then he saw it, a faint rise and fall of her chest. "You're still breathing," Ethan whispered, his voice a mix of disbelief and determination. He reached for his medical kit, his hands moving quickly but carefully. Lyra's alien physiology was unlike anything he had encountered before, but he couldn't let that stop him. Time was running out, and he had to act fast. As he worked, Lyra stirred weakly, her eyelids fluttering open. Her gaze met Ethan's, and for a brief moment, fear flashed in her eyes. She tried to speak, but her voice was no more than a whisper in a language Ethan didn't understand. Her hand, trembling and cold, reached out to him, as if pleading for help. "I don't know if you can understand me," Ethan said softly, "but I'm going to help you. Just hang on." The moment was surreal. A human medic and an alien princess, two souls from completely different worlds, brought together by chance in the harshest of circumstances. Ethan didn't know who she was or why she was here, but he didn't need to. All that mattered was saving her life. As the twin suns dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren land, Ethan worked tirelessly to stabilize Lyra. He used every tool and trick he had, knowing that failure was not an option. And as he worked, a thought crossed his mind. What had this being gone through to end up here, abandoned, and on the brink of death? Little did Ethan know, this encounter would change both their fates forever. The rescue. Ethan's hands moved with precision as he assessed the alien woman's fragile condition. Her breathing was shallow, and her body trembled with each faint inhale. The freezing winds seemed to press in, a relentless force working against his efforts. He rummaged through his medical kit, pulling out a thermal blanket and wrapping it gently around her slender frame. Her skin, a shimmering silver, was ice-cold to the touch, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the brink of death. "I don't know what species you are," he muttered, his voice carried away by the howling winds, "but you're not dying on my watch." The medical scanner on his wrist beeped erratically, struggling to interpret her alien physiology. The readings made little sense to him. Her vitals were unlike any he had seen before, and her internal organs appeared to be in flux, adapting to the harsh environment. It was clear her body was resilient in ways that defied human understanding, but even that resilience had limits. Ethan worked quickly, applying a portable oxygen device to her face. "If this doesn't work," he trailed off, not wanting to finish the thought. Every action felt like a gamble. He injected her with a universal stabilizer, a cocktail of nutrients and energy compounds designed to support a wide range of life forms. The results were immediate but subtle. Her breathing steadied slightly, and a hint of color returned to her skin. As he continued his efforts, Lyra's eyes fluttered open again, faint but aware. Her gaze locked onto Ethan's, and her lips parted to form words in her native tongue. The sounds were melodic, almost musical, but completely incomprehensible to him. She struggled to lift a hand, her fingers brushing weakly against his arm. Save your strength," Ethan said gently. He placed a hand over hers, hoping the gesture would convey his intent. "I'm here to help." Lyra's eyes glistened with unused tears as she stared at the strange human who had appeared out of nowhere. She didn't understand his words, but his actions spoke louder than any language. For the first time since her exile, she felt a spark of hope, a fragile, fleeting thing, but enough to keep her clinging to life. Ethan glanced at the horizon. The twin suns were setting, casting a dim, reddish glow over the desolate landscape. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and he knew they wouldn't survive the night out in the open. He needed to find shelter, and fast. "I need to get you out of here," he said, lifting her carefully. Her wings, translucent and crystalline, were lighter than he expected, but they added a layer of complexity to carrying her. He adjusted his grip, ensuring she was secure before trudging toward his crashed ship in the distance. The journey back was grueling. The wind bit at his exposed face, and the uneven terrain made every step a challenge. Ethan's breaths came in sharp bursts as he pushed forward, determined not to falter. He stole a glance at Lyra, who was slipping in and out of consciousness. "Just hold on," he whispered, more to himself than to her. By the time they reached the ship, Ethan's muscles burned with exhaustion. He carried Lyra inside, carefully laying her on a makeshift bed made from thermal padding. The interior of the ship was damaged, but still offered some protection from the elements. Ethan activated the emergency power, bringing a faint warmth to the cabin. He set to work again, this time with a clearer plan. The stabilizer had bought him time, but he needed to learn more about her biology to provide effective care. Using a handheld analyzer, he scanned her body, his mind racing to interpret the data. Her physiology was a puzzle, both familiar and alien. Her blood carried oxygen like a human's, but also contained a luminescent compound that seemed to regulate her energy levels. Her heart, though faint, beat in a steady rhythm, but she had two secondary circulatory systems that baffled him. Ethan scribbled notes into his data pad, his scientific curiosity battling with his urgency to keep her alive. "Who are you?" he murmured, glancing at her peaceful face. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Hours passed, and the ship grew quieter as the storm outside raged on. Ethan sat by Lyra's side, his exhaustion threatening to overtake him. But just as his eyelids began to droop, a sound startled him. Lyra stirred, her hand reaching out to grip his wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she spoke in a halting but decipherable voice. "Why? Save me." Ethan blinked, surprised that she could form words he could understand, even partially. He leaned closer, his voice soft but firm. "Because you're alive. And as long as you're alive, there's a chance." Lyra stared at him, her expression a mix of confusion and gratitude. She had expected death, even welcomed it at one point. But now, this human, a stranger from another world, had given her something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. As the storm outside began to subside, Ethan felt a renewed determination. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let her go without a fight. Building trust. The faint hum of the ship's emergency systems filled the cabin as Ethan watched over Lyra. Her breathing had steadied, and the faint glow in her veins pulsated rhythmically, a detail he found both fascinating and reassuring. Despite the dire situation, he couldn't deny the strange beauty of her alien form. But there was no time for awe. Trust had to be established, and it had to happen fast if they were to survive. Lyra stirred, her crystalline wings twitching slightly as her eyes fluttered open. She blinked at the dim light around her, her gaze landing on Ethan. Her initial reaction was one of instinctive fear. Her body tensed, her wings partially extending in a defensive posture, shimmering like shards of glass catching the dying sun. "Whoa, easy," Ethan said, raising his hand slowly in a universal gesture of peace. He stayed seated on a nearby crate, ensuring he wasn't towering over her. His voice was calm but firm. "You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." Lyra didn't respond immediately. Her sharp, alien eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the strange surroundings. Then her gaze returned to Ethan, scrutinizing him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. She spoke, her voice melodic, but laden with unfamiliar words that Ethan couldn't decipher. It was clear she was trying to communicate, but their languages were miles apart. Ethan nodded, his mind racing for a way to bridge the gap. He reached for his datapad, opening a basic translation program. "Let's try this," he said, keeping his tone steady. He gestured to himself. "Ethan." Lyra tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. She hesitated, then pointed weakly to herself. "Lyra," she said, her voice like a whisper carried on the wind. Ethan smiled. "Lyra," he repeated, nodding. "Good. That's a start." He could see her relaxing slightly, though the tension in her posture hadn't fully dissipated. Ethan decided to take it a step further. He mimicked the action of drinking and then pointed to her. "Thirsty?" he asked. When she didn't respond, he repeated the gesture, this time reaching for a container of water. He held it out cautiously. Lyra's eyes flicked to the container, then back to him. After a moment of hesitation, she extended a trembling hand to take it. Her fingers brushed against his, sending a slight shiver down his spine. Her touch was cold but oddly electric. She sipped the water slowly, her eyes never leaving his. Ethan took the opportunity to study her more closely. Her features, though undeniably alien, were expressive and carried a depth of emotion he hadn't expected. He saw fear, exhaustion, but also a flicker of gratitude. He knew that trust was fragile and would take time to build. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Ethan said softly, though he knew she wouldn't understand. Still, speaking aloud helped him process the situation. "I don't know who left you out there, but I'm not going to let them finish the job." Lyra tilted her head again, as if trying to grasp the meaning behind his words. She set the water down and pointed to herself, then mimed a dramatic sweeping motion, as if being cast away. Her wings drooped as she finished the gesture, her eyes downcast. Ethan's chest tightened. He didn't need a translator to understand what she was trying to say. She had been abandoned. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the sincerity in his tone evident, even if the words were meaningless to her. She looked up at him, her expression softening further. Then, hesitating slightly, she pointed at him and mimed the crash of a ship. Ethan raised an eyebrow, impressed by her perceptiveness. "Yeah, that was me," he said with a small chuckle. "Not my best landing." For the first time, the corners of Lyra's mouth lifted into what he could only describe as a faint, tentative smile. It was a small victory, but to Ethan, it was monumental. He felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about survival anymore. He had a responsibility to this remarkable being, to show her that not all life was cruel. Their interaction was interrupted by a faint beeping from Ethan's scanner. He glanced at it and frowned. The hostile readings were back. Ships in orbit, likely scanning the planet's surface. He cursed under his breath. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" he said, turning to Lyra. She didn't need to understand the words to recognize the urgency in his voice. Her wings twitched, and her eyes widened with a mix of fear and resignation. Ethan shook his head firmly. "No, I'm not letting them take you." Lyra watched him closely, her expression shifting. For the first time, she saw something in this human that she hadn't seen in her own people, a willingness to fight for her, not because of obligation or gain, but because it was the right thing to do. She placed a hand on his chest, directly over his heart, and murmured a single word in her language. Though Ethan didn't understand it, the way she said it felt significant. He covered her hand with his own and smiled. "We're in this together, Lyra. I promise." As the scanner continued to beep ominously, Ethan began to formulate a plan. The odds were against them, but he wasn't about to back down. Trust had been established, fragile but growing, and now it was time to turn that trust into action. Secrets of the Princess. The soft hum of the ship's emergency systems provided a faint comfort in the silence that followed. Ethan leaned back against the wall of the cramped cabin, his eyes fixed on Lyra. She was sitting up now, her wings draped around her like a shimmering cloak. She still looked fragile, but her breathing was steady, and there was a quiet strength in her gaze. They had begun to bridge the gap between their worlds, but Ethan knew there was more to her story, something heavy that weighed on her shoulders. Lyra raised a hand, pointing at Ethan's datapad lying on the floor beside him. Her eyes met his, and she tilted her head in a gesture that seemed to ask permission. Ethan nodded, handing the device to her carefully. She examined it with curious precision, her slender fingers tracing the screen's edge. Then, with surprising dexterity, she began sketching with a stylus Ethan hadn't expected her to notice. The image she created was hauntingly beautiful, a grand palace made of crystalline spires that seemed to glow with an internal light. Surrounding it were figures, her people, their wings glinting like polished gems. At the center of the scene was a smaller figure, slightly apart from the others. It didn't take Ethan long to realize it was Lyra, her extra set of wings depicted with intricate detail. "That's you," Ethan said softly, pointing at the central figure. Lyra nodded, her expression shadowed with a mix of pride and sorrow. She turned the stylus again and added another figure, a towering male with sharp features and a stern expression. He stood above the others, a crown perched on his head. Lyra pointed at him, then touched her chest and lowered her gaze. Ethan's breath caught as the realization dawned on him. "Your father," he murmured. Lyra didn't need to understand his words to feel the weight in them. She pointed back at the king and drew another figure, smaller, more delicate, standing beside him. A woman, regal and poised, with an air of authority in her stance. Lyra's mother, Ethan assumed. But the way Lyra's hand trembled as she drew the queen's face told Ethan that the memory wasn't a comforting one. "What happened?" Ethan asked gently, though he knew she couldn't answer in his language. Instead, she turned back to the datapad, this time drawing a pod. An exile ship, he realized, and herself inside it. Around the pod, She sketched the faces of her people, their expressions cold and unforgiving. She added lines of text in her language, the symbols unfamiliar but conveying a sense of finality. Ethan studied her work, piecing together the fragments of her story. "They cast you out," he said quietly. "Because of this." He gestured toward her extra set of wings, their crystalline structure catching the dim cabin light. They were beautiful, but he could see how they might have been seen as a deviation in a society that valued conformity. Lyra nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She placed a hand over her chest and spoke a single word in her language, her voice trembling. Ethan tilted his head, wishing he could understand her. Seeing his confusion, she pointed at the pad again and wrote a new symbol, then tapped it repeatedly. Ethan activated the ship's rudimentary translation system and fed the symbol into it. A word blinked onto the screen: betrayal. The air between them grew heavy. Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "They saw you as a betrayal," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "Just for being different." Lyra's nod was slow and deliberate. Her gaze, however, was steady, as if daring him to judge her as her people had. But Ethan didn't see a flaw or a curse. He saw resilience, strength, and a quiet grace that her people had failed to recognize. "They were wrong," Ethan said firmly. He leaned forward, his tone resolute. "Whatever they told you, whatever they believed, it doesn't matter here. You survived. That means something." Lyra blinked at him, her expression softening. She reached out, placing her hand on his wrist. Though they didn't share the same language, the gesture spoke volumes. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt seen, not as an outcast, but as someone worth saving. The moment was interrupted by the ship's scanner, emitting a sharp, urgent beep. Ethan grabbed it, his stomach sinking as he read the display. The hostile ship was closer, its search pattern tightening over their location. "They're not giving up," Ethan muttered. He glanced at Lyra, his mind racing. "They're here for you." Lyra didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened, her wings spreading slightly behind her. The glow in her veins intensified, and for the first time, Ethan saw not fear but determination in her eyes. She gestured for the pad again and wrote a single word, one that the translator rendered as "fight." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. "All right then," he said. "If they want to fight, they'll get one. But this time, we do it your way." As they prepared for the inevitable confrontation, Ethan couldn't help but marvel at Lyra's transformation. The timid, abandoned princess was gone. In her place stood someone willing to reclaim her place in the galaxy, not as a victim, but as a force to be reckoned with. The threat arrives. The ship's interior was cloaked in an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional hum of the emergency systems and the soft tapping of Ethan's fingers against the console. Outside, the frozen wasteland stretched endlessly, but something unseen loomed over them. A threat Ethan could feel in the pit of his stomach. The scanner on his wrist flashed red, its display growing more urgent with each passing second. "They're here," he muttered under his breath, glancing toward Lyra. She stood near the ship's viewport, her crystalline wings partially spread and shimmering faintly in the dim light. Her posture was tense, every muscle in her body coiled like a spring. Her sharp eyes scanned the horizon as if she could sense the presence of her pursuers before they came into view. She turned to Ethan and pointed at the scanner, then mimed a sweeping motion that Ethan took to mean, "How close?" "Too close," he replied grimly. He tapped a few buttons on his console, pulling up the ship's external sensors. The large vessel, sleek and menacing, hovered just above the atmosphere. Its long, jagged design and glowing edges exuded an aura of dominance. It wasn't just any ship. It was a royal flagship, unmistakably belonging to Lyra's people. Ethan's jaw tightened as he analyzed the readings. "They're scanning the surface," he said. "They'll pinpoint us in minutes if we don't do something." Lyra stepped closer, her expression calm but determined. She pointed at herself, then at the ship on the scanner. Ethan frowned, shaking his head. No, you're not giving yourself up. That's not an option. Lyra's gaze hardened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she tapped the console and pointed at Ethan's wrist scanner, indicating she wanted to see the ship's layout. Ethan hesitated, then nodded, pulling up a holographic projection of the flagship. Lyra studied it intently, her fingers tracing the glowing lines. She gestured toward a section marked as the power core, then pointed at Ethan's supplies. "You want to take out their power source?" Ethan asked, piecing together her plan. Lyra nodded, her wings flaring slightly as if to emphasize her resolve. "That's insane," Ethan said, though he couldn't deny the logic behind it. "But if we're doing this, we need a way to stay alive long enough to make it work." As if on cue, the ship's sensors emitted a sharp alarm. Ethan glanced at the display, his heart sinking. The flagship had deployed a squadron of drones, their sleek forms descending rapidly toward the surface. "We're out of time," he said. "They found us." Lyra didn't hesitate. She grabbed a nearby weapon, a compact energy blaster from Ethan's emergency kit, and checked its charge with a level of proficiency that surprised him. "You've used one of these before?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. Lyra nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She mimed holding a larger weapon, then pointed to the drawing she had made earlier of the palace. Ethan understood immediately. She had been trained to fight, likely as part of her royal upbringing. Whatever her people had discarded her for, it hadn't included her skills. "All right," Ethan said, grabbing his own weapon and a small pack of supplies. "Let's split up. You distract the drones, and I'll find a way to scramble their sensors. That should buy us some time to execute your plan." Lyra hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. She touched his arm, her gaze locking onto his. Her expression was a mix of gratitude and urgency. Ethan didn't need words to understand. She was thanking him for standing by her, for not abandoning her like the others had. "You're welcome," he said softly. "Now let's stay alive, yeah." The two exited the ship, the biting cold hitting them immediately. The drones were closer now, their sleek, metallic forms cutting through the air with an eerie precision. Lyra took off in one direction, her wings propelling her into the sky with surprising speed and grace. Ethan watched as she fired precise shots at the drones, drawing their attention away from his position. Meanwhile, Ethan sprinted toward a nearby rocky outcrop, his mind racing. He dug through his pack and pulled out a small device, a portable EMP generator. "This should short-circuit their drones for a few minutes," he muttered, setting it up quickly. He glanced at Lyra, who was weaving through the air with incredible agility, dodging the drone's attacks while returning fire with deadly accuracy. With the EMP ready, Ethan activated it, sending out a pulse that rippled through the air. The drones froze mid-flight, their lights flickering before they crashed to the ground. Lyra landed nearby, her breath visible in the cold air. She gave Ethan a nod, her expression one of approval. But the victory was short-lived. A deafening roar echoed through the sky as the flagship descended lower, its massive form casting a shadow over the frozen wasteland. Ethan and Lyra exchanged a glance, both knowing what was coming. "They're sending ground troops," Ethan said grimly. "We've got to move." Lyra pointed toward a distant ridge, gesturing for Ethan to follow. Together, they sprinted across the icy terrain, their breath coming in sharp bursts as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder behind them. Ethan's mind raced as he considered their next move. The odds were stacked against them, but for the first time, Ethan felt a strange sense of hope. Lyra wasn't the broken figure he had found in the snow. She was a fighter, a survivor, and together, they might just stand a chance. As they reached the ridge and prepared for the next stage of their fight, Ethan glanced at her and said, "Let's show them what happens when they underestimate us." Lyra didn't smile, but the fire in her eyes said it all. The human solution. The wind howled across the ridge as Ethan and Lyra took cover behind the jagged rocks. The cold was biting, but the immediate danger was far more pressing. The ground troops from the flagship had landed, their armored forms moving in unison toward their position. Ethan's heart raced as he observed them through the narrow gap in the rocks. These weren't just any soldiers. They were elite warriors from Lyra's own species, trained in combat and armed with energy rifles that could melt stone with a single shot. They had one goal: capture or eliminate Lyra, no matter the cost. Ethan's fingers trembled as he adjusted his weapon, the energy blaster now fully charged. "We got one shot at this," he whispered to Lyra, who was crouched beside him, her wings tightly wrapped around her body to shield herself from the wind. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, he saw doubt flicker in them. But just as quickly, it was replaced by a steely resolve. She was no longer the abandoned princess. She was a warrior, ready to fight for her survival. Lyra pointed toward the soldiers' formation. There were 5 of them, moving in a tight, coordinated group. They hadn't seen Ethan and Lyra yet, but it was only a matter of time before their position was compromised. The winds had kicked up, obscuring their movement, but their technology was advanced enough to pierce the storm and track their heat signatures. They couldn't stay hidden much longer. Ethan's mind raced. The EMP had been useful, but they couldn't rely on it forever. And as much as he wanted to trust in Lyra's skills, he knew she couldn't take on all 5 soldiers alone, especially with their superior weapons and armor. "Lyra," he said, his voice low but determined, "we need a diversion. Something big enough to confuse them long enough for us to make a move." She nodded, her gaze flickering toward a large cluster of rocks behind the enemy group. There was a natural formation, a cave-like hollow that could give them cover and, more importantly, provide a strategic advantage. But getting to it meant crossing the open ground, and that was the last thing they could afford to do without being seen. Lyra held up her hand, signaling that she had an idea. She pointed to a small rockslide higher up on the ridge, then mimed an explosion. Ethan frowned at first, but then the idea clicked. "You want to cause a rockslide to draw their attention?" he asked, his voice low in disbelief. Lyra gave him a quick nod and smiled faintly, as though reassuring him that she had a plan. She reached into the pouch at her side and pulled out a small device, a detonator, Ethan realized. It wasn't much bigger than a grenade, but it was powerful enough to trigger a cascade of rocks from the ridge above. If they timed it right, the soldiers would be distracted long enough for them to make their move. Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the grip of his weapon. "All right, I'll cover you. You get to the detonator, and I'll take out anyone who gets too close." Lyra didn't hesitate. She unfolded her wings, which glistened in the fading light, and darted off in the direction of the ridge, her movements swift and fluid. Ethan's heart raced as he watched her, admiring both her courage and her skill. She was more than just a princess. She was a fighter, and he had to admit that he hadn't expected to see her shine in this way. He focused on the enemy soldiers, keeping them in his sights through the scope of his blaster. They were still moving, unaware of the danger closing in on them. The wind and snow were beginning to mask his position, but he couldn't risk being spotted. His finger hovered over the trigger, waiting for the perfect moment. Lyra reached the ridge and pressed herself against the rocks, her wings shimmering as she activated the detonator. The device let out a soft peep, and within seconds, a massive roar echoed through the landscape. The ground trembled beneath them as a wall of rocks and debris came crashing down on the soldiers' path, sending them scattering in all directions. The noise was deafening, and the soldiers were thrown into disarray, their formation shattered. Now was their chance. Ethan sprang into action, firing a precise shot at the nearest soldier, sending him crashing to the ground. The remaining 4 soldiers quickly reacted, ducking behind rocks and drawing their weapons. But the confusion caused by the rockslide had given Ethan and Lyra the upper hand. Lyra swooped down from her perch, her wings slicing through the air as she fired a few well-aimed shots, each one taking down a soldier with deadly accuracy. Her movements were a blur, a dance of lethal grace that left no room for error. The remaining soldiers were scrambling, trying to regroup, but they were too slow. Ethan and Lyra were already one step ahead. As another soldier raised his rifle, Ethan took him out with a single shot to the chest. The soldier crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless. Lyra landed gracefully beside him, her wings folding tightly behind her. She gave Ethan a nod of approval, her eyes glowing with fierce pride. "We make a good team," she said, her voice a quiet but confident whisper. Ethan couldn't help but smile. "You were amazing," he replied, his eyes scanning the battlefield. They had taken down 4 of the soldiers, but there was still one left, and he was retreating toward the flagship, likely to call for reinforcements. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the last soldier's retreat. She pointed toward the ship, then mimed a slicing motion across her throat. The meaning was clear. She wasn't about to let anyone escape. Ethan nodded, tightening his grip on his blaster. "You go high, I'll go low. We finish this together." They moved in unison, their footsteps silent against the snow-covered ground. As they closed the distance, the last soldier reached the ship's landing pad. But before he could reach the safety of the ship's bulkhead, a shot rang out. Lyra's energy blast hit him square in the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground, lifeless. The battlefield fell silent. Ethan and Lyra stood together, their breaths heavy but controlled. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the danger wasn't over. They still had to deal with the flagship and the reinforcements it would undoubtedly send. But for the first time since they'd met, Ethan felt a sense of victory, not just for their survival, but for the bond they had forged. "Let's finish this," Lyra said, her voice cold and determined. Ethan nodded. Together, redemption and freedom. The twin suns dipped lower on the horizon, casting the barren landscape in an eerie twilight glow. The harsh winds had subsided, leaving a fragile calm hanging in the air. The wreckage of the battle lay scattered across the snow, fallen soldiers, broken drones, and the remnants of a fierce struggle. Ethan and Lyra stood at the edge of the battlefield, surveying the aftermath. Lyra's breath was steady now, her wings folded neatly behind her, the glow in her veins dimming as the adrenaline of the fight faded. Ethan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for her. She had fought with a quiet intensity, each movement deliberate and precise. She was a warrior, not just a princess cast aside by her people. The woman standing beside him was something far more powerful than the exiled outcast he had found in the snow. Ethan turned to face her. "You did it," he said softly, his voice full of awe. Lyra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she lowered her gaze, her expression contemplative. She had been running from her past for so long, but today, she had fought for something more. She had fought for herself, for the freedom to choose her own path. She had reclaimed her dignity, and in the process, found an unlikely ally in Ethan. "I'm not the same person they cast aside," Lyra said, her voice tinged with emotion. She lifted her head, her eyes meeting Ethan's with a clarity he hadn't seen before. "I never was." Ethan smiled gently. "No, you're not. And neither am I. We both came here looking for something. And I think we found it." Lyra looked at the horizon, her gaze distant as if contemplating the world beyond. "I used to think I didn't belong anywhere," she admitted. "My people thought I was broken. But now I see. I was just different. I have a place in this universe, even if it's not with them." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "You have a place here, with us. With me." Lyra turned to him, her expression softening. There was something in her eyes, a glimmer of hope, of something that had been buried deep inside her for too long. She stepped closer to him, her wings slightly unfurling as if embracing the moment. "And what about you? What will you do now?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the landscape. The crash of his ship had seemed like an end, but now it felt more like a beginning. A chance at something new, something he hadn't expected. He'd come to this planet to help, but in the process, he had found something far more profound than he had ever anticipated. He had found Lyra, and together, They had forged a bond that transcended their differences. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not going anywhere. Not now." Lyra smiled, her lips curving into a rare, genuine expression of happiness. "Then we're both lost, together," she said, her voice light, but with an undertone of strength. "We can figure it out, together." The words settled between them, and for the first time since their meeting, there was no urgency, no looming threat. The world felt still and full of possibility. They were no longer just survivors of a battle. They were two people, bound by an unexpected connection, with an uncertain but hopeful future ahead. As they stood there, a faint rumble reverberated through the ground, signaling the approach of more ships. Ethan's hand instinctively reached for his blaster, but Lyra placed a calming hand on his arm. "Let them come," she said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "We're ready for whatever comes next." Ethan looked at her, his heart pounding with the realization that this woman, the exiled princess, the warrior, the survivor, had become something far more important than just an ally. She had become a symbol of everything he had been fighting for in his own life: redemption, freedom, and the chance to make a difference. The sound of engines grew louder, and soon a fleet of ships descended from the sky, landing with precise efficiency. These were different ships, not the royal warriors that had pursued them, but vessels of a different kind. They landed on the icy surface, their doors opening with a hiss. Armed soldiers poured out, but unlike the previous ones, these were not hostile. A figure emerged from the lead ship, a tall woman with piercing eyes and a dignified presence. She wore the regalia of royalty, her posture commanding but without the arrogance that Ethan had come to associate with Lyra's people. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the battlefield before locking onto Lyra. Lyra stiffened, her wings flicking nervously, but she didn't move. She had faced the wrath of her people before, but this was different. This time, she wasn't alone. The woman raised a hand, signaling the soldiers to stand down. "You've survived," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I never expected to see you alive, Princess." Lyra's expression remained unreadable. She stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not the princess you knew," she said quietly. "I'm no longer a part of your court. I've chosen my own path." The woman regarded her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I see. You've changed. Perhaps it is time I did as well." Ethan watched the exchange closely, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about transformation, the possibility of change, not just for Lyra, but for her people as well. The woman turned to Ethan, her eyes narrowing slightly as if evaluating him. "And you? You're the human who helped her." Ethan met her gaze with a calm confidence. "I'm just a medic who did what needed to be done." The woman studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "You've earned my respect, human." She turned back to Lyra. "You've both earned a chance. What you do with it is up to you." Lyra stood tall, her wings extending slightly as she spoke with newfound strength. "I'll make my own future, one that doesn't involve betrayal or exile." The woman smiled faintly. "Then go with my blessing." Ethan and Lyra exchanged a glance, one that spoke volumes about their journey, about how far they had come, and what they had endured. The past was behind them, and the future stretched out before them, uncertain but filled with endless possibility. With one final glance at the woman and her fleet, Ethan turned and followed Lyra as she walked toward the horizon. Together, they stepped into the unknown, no longer defined by their pasts, but by the choices they would make moving forward. They were free.